Spock was the face of the show, and yet, at one point, they were preparing to lose him. And the scramble to replace him reveals everything about Star Trek's fragile early days.
The following program is brought to you in living color by Trek World.
The following video is the most current in a series of videos that will give you a truly unique viewpoint of the behind-the-scenes happenings during production of Star Trek: The Original Series. The video is based entirely and exclusively on the book Inside Star Trek, which was written by Herb Solow and Bob Justman. You will find an affiliated link in the description that will take you to Amazon to check on availability of a good deal. I highly recommend that you buy a copy of this book and read it. Between this book and The Making of Star Trek by Stephen Whitfield and Gene Roddenberry, you have the only insiders present at those earliest days to carry these stories forward. Or, as they say, straight from the horse's mouth. There's a thread running through the book that feels almost like a heartbeat, steady at first, then anxious, then pounding. It appears each time Leonard Nimoy's name comes up, especially when the story turns toward those uneasy months when the production feared it might lose him. The entire atmosphere changes. Voices tighten. Memos grow sharper. You can feel the tension rising like a pressure wave under the floorboards. Spock wasn't just another character. He wasn't interchangeable. He wasn't optional. He was the axis the show rotated around, visually, emotionally, philosophically. And the terrifying truth that the book reveals is this. There was a moment when the studio genuinely believed Nimoy was leaving, and they quietly began preparing for life without him. It's almost painful to imagine, but it happened. And the book chronicles this story with raw honesty. Let me take you back to those early days after The Cage. The first pilot. NBC had reservations about almost everything in it. The story, the pacing, the cerebral tone, the characters. But there was one thing, one silhouette, one presence they couldn't ignore. Spock. Even when they called him too devilish, even when they questioned the ears, the eyebrows, and the strange intensity he brought to the screen, the network kept circling back to him. Spock mesmerized them. The executives were confused by him, maybe even unsettled, but fascinated nonetheless. The book makes this tension clear. NBC didn't entirely understand Spock, but they knew he mattered. So when the second pilot Where No Man Has Gone Before was ordered, Nimoy was the only cast member from The Cage they insisted on keeping. This reality was very different from the story Roddenberry was spreading around that they wanted him gone, and he was fighting to keep him. But they wanted him changed, softened, humanized. They didn't want the demonic look, didn't want the original severity, didn't want audiences to recoil. That pressure alone might have driven some actors away. Nimoy stood in a very strange place, beloved yet threatened, central yet questioned. And then came the negotiations. Contracts aren't emotional things, but the book paints these negotiations as borderline traumatic. Nimoy had leverage, real leverage. NBC wanted him. The producers needed him. Roddenberry adored him. But the contract discussions dragged on, complicated by everything from pay to credit to personal concerns. The studio tried subtle tactics, then not so subtle tactics, then borderline psychological ones. The book captures this chilling detail. While still trying to secure Nimoy, they quietly began auditioning replacements. Not openly, not loudly, but in whispers, inside meetings, in quiet conversations after hours. And two names emerged, two men who could, in theory, step into the role if the unthinkable happened. Mark Lenard, Larry Montaigne. Reading those lines hits hard, because the book doesn't treat this as rumor. It's fact. The production genuinely began mapping out what a Spockless Star Trek might look like. And you can feel the fear between the lines, because everyone knew what was at stake. Spock wasn't just the alien. He was the emotional counterweight to Kirk, the ideological foil for McCoy, the embodiment of Roddenberry's future: logic, control, compassion, beneath restraint. Losing him would have ripped out the spine of the show, and yet the fear was real enough that they started auditioning shadows. Montaigne had the cheekbones, the coolness, the angular features. Leonard had the gravitas, the natural authority, the voice that could cut through turbulence. But as the book makes painfully clear, neither could replicate what Nimoy brought. Not the stillness, not the depth, not the strange mix of warmth and distance that made Spock feel alive. But the contingency planning continued, because the negotiations kept stalling. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into dread, and somewhere in those discussions the book tells us something subtle but profound. The moment Roddenberry realized that losing Nimoy wasn't just a casting problem, it was a vision problem. Now, Spock represented the dream Roddenberry wanted to show the world: a humanity that embraced difference, a future where being other wasn't a burden, but a strength. A character who walked between two worlds, human and Vulcan, mirroring Roddenberry's own belief that humanity could bridge any divide. So losing Nimoy wasn't losing an actor. It was losing the ideology of the show. And that's when Roddenberry dug in. He refused to build a universe that didn't include Spock. But the studio didn't see it that way at first. They were thinking budgets and contracts. Roddenberry was thinking myth-making. And that disconnect nearly tore everything apart. The book describes late-night meetings, producers pacing, desperation creeping in, people trying to hide their worry from the rest of the cast. And Nimoy? He stayed quiet, professional, thoughtful, not dramatic, not combative, but firm. He knew his value, knew the character's value, knew how deeply the show needed him, and somewhere in that tense middle ground, NBC tried a tactic that now feels almost absurd. They attempted to bluff. A quiet whisper here.
We have alternatives.
An implication there.
We can recast the alien.
A hint elsewhere.
Maybe the role isn't as irreplaceable as you think.
But the book reveals the truth behind those whispers. Nobody believed it. Not the producers. Not the crew. Not even NBC, deep down. The replacements were good actors, but the heart wasn't there. The chemistry wasn't there. The alchemy wasn't there. This wasn't a role. It was a presence. Then comes the part of the book that always hits me hardest. The moment when the production team, feeling the wall closing in, privately admitted that losing Nimoy might mean losing the show itself. If Spock disappeared, Star Trek might survive, but it wouldn't live. You can feel the emotion rising in those recollections, a sense of protectiveness around Nimoy that transcended business. He wasn't just the guy with the ears, he was the compass, the anchor, the one who made Roddenberry's universe feel grounded, believable, and achingly complicated. And then, finally, the contract landed. And the book doesn't give the dramatic flourish of triumph, it gives relief. Quiet, exhausted, grateful relief. People exhaling, shoulders unclenching, the producers smiling for the first time in days. Spock was staying, and the bridge felt whole again. When filming resumed, the energy shifted. Nimoy returned to set with the steadiness he always carried. Shatner relaxed into the rapport that made their dynamic iconic. The writers breathed easier, knowing they hadn't lost their philosophical center. And those two replacement names, Leonard and Montaigne, they didn't vanish. The book hints at something almost poetic. They would eventually appear in the show, but never as Spock. Their talent had a place in the universe, but not in the role that only Nimoy could embody. That's the beauty of the story. The battle to keep Nimoy wasn't about ego. It wasn't about contracts. It wasn't about winning a negotiation. It was about maintaining the balance of Star Trek.